All right, here we are, looking at Crime and Punishment Part 2, the long awaited sequel. What were your guys' first impressions to the second part of Crime and Punishment?
The first the second part is having Rokosnkov deal with the mentality after committing the murder,
Yeah.
and we see him go through. I, I would imagine that he's going through some kind of fever dream. That's what I would call it. He hallucinates. He passes out. He's taken care of by another landlady, and he's also trying his best to cover his tracks. And we see him go through this psychological change. And we can actually see that too in the description of him wandering through the towns too. And we see that the town is it's more ugly than it was in part one,
Mm-hmm.
much more ugly. And it seems like he's going through this internal struggle. He wants to be able to unfold what he has done, but at the same time, part of himself is sort of refusing to do so. He
Yeah.
wants to be able to remain changeless, but he knows exactly what that might have. Continues to go down the hellish path.
Yeah. I have a great quote or a passage in the book. It says, "He walked on without resting. He had a terrible longing for some distraction, but he did not know what to do, what to attempt. A new overwhelming sensation was gaining more and more mastery over him every moment. This was an immeasurable, almost physical repulsion to everything surrounding him, an obstinate, malignant feeling of hatred. All who met him were loathsome to him. He loathed their faces, their movements, their gestures. If anyone had addressed him, he felt that he might have spat on him or bitten him."
Yeah,
That's
that's
so
actually that's a really good quote because this is like part two is the insight into the mind after the event, and
Yes.
that's what's interesting I think about this whole book is that they very quickly get to the climax of the events in the first part, and he commits this murder. And right away, it's sort of this journey through the mind of a man who logically and weighing the morals of the situation in part one
Yeah.
established reason to do this thing, but then has this conflict, this huge internal conflict after committing this crime, and now he's perceiving this world as so much sicker and darker, and of course himself is sicker and darker and is completely conflicted by how to feel and how to act because he had no idea what it was he was signing up for. And we get
Yeah.
a great insight into the impact that it's having on him in this part.
Yeah, so it's like part one was the crime, and then the rest of the book we're gonna see his punishment.
Yeah, it should almost be crime and suffering and fever and punishment.
Yeah.
and in a way, he's after committing the murder, he's he's letting the event of murder slowly change him into a different person. Like how like the scene where he begins to toy with the detective. He it gets to a suspenseful point where he's about to confess, but then all of a sudden he just turns around and says, "Oh, it's gossip and everything. I'm just pulling
Yeah.
your leg there,
He
detective."
turns around and says, "Admit it. Admit
He,
it. You fell for it, didn't you? You actually believed for a second that I had committed the crime." And then he's just like, "No, not anymore. I believe it
Yeah,
less now than ever."
it's really weird. There's a couple points in this part where he almost confesses to
Yeah.
the murder because obviously a part of him is really upset about the fact that he's done this and that he has to live with it and has absolutely no tools to cope with the reality that he's creating for himself. But on the other hand, he doesn't want to pay the price
Yeah.
because then it would have just all been for naught. I mean, if you're going to commit the crime of killing a woman who's abusing poor and down on their luck individuals by pawning their items and giving them nothing for it and charging them interest, and then taking her money and, in his mind, in part one, actually doing something good with his life. He can't admit to the crime, and he needs to take the money and get his lessons and make something of his life. But he's just completely overcome with his emotions, and he's in this fevered state for the bulk of the part, where he's literally being taken care of by his friend, and his friend taking care of him is not making a positive impact on him. He almost despises every single person in his life now, probably more so than he despises himself. But it's just this distraction, this facade to distract himself away from dealing with what it is he's done.
And I mean, I've never killed anybody, but I definitely have felt a similar way, in that like you feel just like everybody's against you. It's the dark place.
Absolutely. I'm sure everyone can relate to the sentiment of the world feeling darker when you yourself are not in a light and happy place. Like, the man who thinks he can and the man who thinks he can't, both are right. And I think that's the best adage to relate to this, because that's all I have to go on. I also haven't murdered anyone, but I'm pretty sure that if I did, I would think ill of more people and realize the capabilities of humanity.
Yeah. And before the little incident with Zamatov where he just confesses and then turns it into a goof, you see him like stewing in his own filth, basically just sitting in his room saying it's got to be done today. I got to finish it today. I don't really know what needs to be done, but I can't go on living like this. You get the feeling that he's going to go out and actively like looking to confess, or something a lot darker than that. But you really see him struggling to make that decision.
One of the things, I don't know if you guys found this as important and interesting as I did, but when the fiance, Peter Petrovich,
Peter Petrovich,
let me just
Lucian.
Side tangent. The worst part about reading this book is, though it is in English, all of the names are still very heavily Russian, and I have no idea how to pronounce these names, so apologies in advance.
Yeah, we're not Russian. But forgive us.
That whole meeting with the fiance, where he's like posturing himself as this intellectual man, and he's talking about really capitalism and a shift in the culture of Russia, which I'm sure has been going on for hundreds of years, because this is a very religious culture, like incredibly religious culture. Like, you think Christians in America deal with shame and guilt? Russia is on a different level, and I think that's really well described with the fiance.
Yeah, Dostoevsky talks about it so much in his other books, like The Brothers Karamazov as well. That's one of the many themes that he goes and it's realistic as possible.
And it's interesting because, again, growing up agnostic, atheist, whatever you want to pigeonhole me into, not being certain of what it is, like I didn't have that whole original sin conversation where I thought, okay, I'm a sinner and I should feel shame for my actions and constantly repent, and that all of my life's purpose should be sort of intertwined with this whole idea of shame and guilt and never being able to reach perfection. But this Russian culture of, you need to give yourself to God and repent to ever have an internal happiness and understanding of self, it is very different from the culture that I've grown up in. And I think it's a nice window into that world, being able to read the Russian classics and understand where this is coming from. Because Russia overall, I know very little about. Like in America, Russia is, especially right now, like with everything that's going on with Donald Trump and all that, they're just this huge superpower that exists, and they're bigger than Canada in terms of geography, and Vladimir Putin is a very badass individual. You don't hear much about their religion, but when you read the books, you realize, like, oh, right, like Jesus was over there too, and Scripture has had a huge impact on the forming of this society.
Yeah, well, that was a big thing with communism too. Secularism kind of took over
And in
20th
a way,
century.
I think the fiance is also somewhat of a symbolic character trying to, I wouldn't exactly say get into the mind of Kozengov, but just trying to fish him out from the sea, so to speak. Spiritual.
It's
She's like a
almost
spiritual guide in a way.
like he almost is trying to impress him at first, and everything that he does to impress him just pisses him off. And I honestly, I want to compare the fiance to like some of the characters we have in Atlas Shrugged. Like he's almost capitalistic in nature, talking about the worthiness of selfishness, and that he can be of more benefit to society if he benefits himself first. Like that seems very much like the capitalistic writings of Atlas Shrugged, which is weird to have in the center of this Russian classic.
Yeah, and I don't remember, but is the main character like a college student or something?
Yeah. I like to call him Rodia because I, again, don't want to pronounce any names, but Rodia was, he's in St. Petersburg. He was taking lessons. He ran out of money because he drinks too much vodka and had to stop taking his lessons and failed to pay his rent. And really, he's the child that is supposed to be bringing fame and recognition and profit to the family, like his mother and his sister. Exactly. His mother and his sister are putting out everything they can for his success, and he's squandering it. And of course, I imagine that ties deeply into his guilt and shame and the action that he's committed. I do find in this part, one of the weirder character interactions is his good friend Razumihin. I'm butchering that name again. So right after committing the murder, he visits his friend, and his friend offers him some work doing translations, and then he storms off and goes into his fevered state. And for some reason, throughout the bulk of this part, the pushing force is his friend taking care of him and fixing his situation with his landlady and getting him new clothing and making sure he's fed. And like, this is a man
basically
who
nurses him back to health, finds his sock for him. Everything.
he does everything for a man whom up until recently he didn't even know where he lived. He didn't know what he was up to. They aren't even in a good spot. I wouldn't say that they were close friends 7 chapters ago, but now this guy's just stepped up and he's doing everything almost because he has some sort of great moral compass and thinks internally that, well, I know this man and we're friends, and he's in a bad spot, so I ought to help him, and all the while perhaps defend this painter man who is being accused of the murder. And it's so interesting because he's clearly coming from a good place, but everything that he's doing is ultimately undoing Rodia's position and rotting away at his own internal dialogue and creating what's going to unfold in the next few parts.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that he had all the gems and the money from the pawnbroker just stuffed away in a corner in the wall, while there's like 3 or 4 people coming in and out of his house all the time while he's unconscious. He finally comes to and realizes that, oh geez, they're probably all just messing with me right now. They know I've committed the murder. And he starts getting really paranoid and full of anxiety. I think the author does a really good job of portraying that.
Absolutely.
The details of the punishment.
And it's interesting, too, because it comes to light that, of course, he's done a terrible job of robbing this woman. There was 1,500 rubles sitting in the top drawer of the chest that he stopped looking in and went under her bed and got a whole bunch of trinkets. And really, he's just kind of done a half-baked plan of murder and robbing. And now he realizes he hasn't even done what he meant to do. If he had have gotten the 1,500 rubles, perhaps he would have been in a position to actually do something with his life. But now he's just stuck pawning more things that are stolen. And I mean, in today's age, you wouldn't even be able to do that.
Yeah, it'd be a lot
All the
harder
items
now.
would be stolen, and you would be going to a pawnbroker, and they'd be coming up as stolen, and you'd be reported to the police, and that'd be that.
Yeah, it's a bit harder with barcodes these days.
Yeah. I don't really see there being an opportunity to have a story like this in today's society. I think this sort of one-off, like, happenstance murder robbery that fell into his lap, it doesn't really exist in this society anymore. I think a lot of this story is built on the foundation of a very poor society at the time, where people are doing everything in their power to make a living, but they just have nothing in their power. And what happens is the person who does have any sort of power is a pawnbroker, because they have the money.
I mean, I'm sure you can write a story something like Crime and Punishment today, although it could be, I mean, in American culture at least, it could be summed up artificially and not like in the same style that it was hundreds of years ago when Dostoevsky wrote it. In fact, when I was reading this, Crime and Punishment, there was another book that I had in mind that's similar, that goes through a similar situation. It's called The Listener, and it's a crime book, sort of like a Bonnie and Clyde, star-crossed lovers who commit a crime and then they go out into the deep south to seek their own fortune until they run into somebody who is actually following them and actually listening to their conversation. And in a way, they're trying to cover up their tracks while also dealing with their own mentality, their own insanity. So you could write something like that, probably not as realistically as what Dostoevsky could have written it with Crime and Punishment, but just enough for the reader to fully understand it.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put it past any author that has the conviction to come up with a similar story, but the organic nature of this book is just so perfect. All of the elements fit together so neatly that it's like, okay, yeah, I can see why this individual would feel compelled to do this, being of sane mind and not having any idea of just how much of an impact it would have on his mind, because he's a young guy. This is his first interaction with the real world. Realistically, he's done a bit of tutoring in the past, but all in all, he's trying to get an education, and he hasn't gotten a serious job. And that's just it too. If he were in his 40s,
yeah, he's the equivalent of some guy just coming out of university, like nothing but school. He knows nothing but school, and now he's just thrown into the real world, trying to deal with everything, and then obviously he resorts to murder in the end.
Well, and this is the perfect analogy of why idealistic beliefs don't really pan out the way they do in our mind in the real. That's what he has. He has this ideal that says, I could create more value with the money than this woman is creating right now. But he doesn't get how the real world works. And as soon as he goes out and attempts to do this, to create his own reality by killing this woman and taking her money, he gets confronted with the fact that no, there aren't shortcuts. You can't just relocate money and everything's all roses and sugar plums. It's not like the mind is a mysterious mechanism, and you can't just change reality and not have a toll on your mind. Your actions have an impact.
100%. And there's one point too when he was still sick, at the beginning of the part here, where he's having this, like, an actual fever dream of the landlady getting beaten to death. And then he wakes up and asks the attendants, like, hey, is the landlady okay? And they're just like, they're all looking at him weird, and just like, oh, sometimes the mind just gives you what you want.
Yeah, that was a weird scene, eh?
Yeah.
I guess it illustrates just how deeply fevered and hallucinatory he was. And that, of course, illustrates how messed up he's become from this tragedy that he's committed.
He's in his own version of hell, so to speak.
Absolutely.
Oh yes. Like I might not believe in the afterlife, but heaven and hell on earth is a completely different story. And that's a big part of this book.
Yeah, and he was in hell beforehand, and he committed this action in an attempt to lift himself out of hell. But the irony is that he's only sunk himself deeper into an even more treacherous ring of hell.
Yeah. I guess that's a bit of the old trope of, you try so hard all your life not to be something, and that ends up finding you in the end. Like, all he wants to do is escape hell. He doesn't have a plan to do it. But the path that he chose just sends him further down.
Well, and
It's the only thing on his mind.
And it's that ridiculous adage, the road to hell is lined with good intentions, right?
Yeah.
Like, he was certain that if his intentions were strong enough and his conviction was strong enough, and that if he maintained a careful and logical mind, that he'd be able to do this thing that he had no experience with whatsoever and no empirical evidence to prove his point. He simply played this game in his mind, and he lost when it came to the reality.
Yeah, and he just gets away with the crime through basically blind luck.
Yeah. And that was stressful, going through that whole escape phase of this read. I know that wasn't really part 2, but my God, that was just dreadful. Like, he had no plan at all. He thought he had a plan, but his plan extended to concealing the axe and using the axe to kill the woman. That's it.
Yeah. Nothing ever goes according to plan. That's another life lesson from this book.
Yeah. Yeah, there's quite a few lessons you could take away from this one.
And after his conversation with Zazimov, or Zamatov, I forget which one. The one that he confesses to, Zamatov.
Yeah.
After that conversation, he returns to the scene of the crime, and he has a plan to go to the police station and confess everything. After he looks at the house and he sees he examines how where the painters were and everything when the crime was going forward, and he kind of pieced together what the authorities thought happened, and he had a plan to go to the police station, but a couple things happen along the way. And I have one passage here. It says, Raskolnikov walked straight to X Bridge, stood in the middle, and leaning both elbows on the rail, stared into the distance. On parting with Razumihim, he felt so much weaker that he could scarcely reach this place. He longed to sit or lie down somewhere in the streets. Bending over the water, he gazed mechanically at the last pink flush of the sunset, at a row of houses glowing dark, gathering twilight, at one distant attic window on the left bank, flashing as though on fire in the last rays of the setting sun. At the darkening water of the canal, the water seemed to catch his attention. At last, red circles flashed before his eyes. The houses seemed moving. The passers-by, the canal banks, the carriages all danced before his eyes. Suddenly he stared, saved again, perhaps from swooning by an uncanny and hideous sight. He became aware of someone standing on the right side of him. He looked and saw a tall woman with a kerchief on her head and a long yellow-wasted face, red sunken eyes. She was looking straight at him, but obviously she saw nothing and recognized no one. Suddenly she leaned her right hand on the parapet, lifted her right leg over the railing, then her left, and threw herself into the canal. The filthy water parted, swallowed up its victim for a moment, but an instant later the drowning woman floated to the surface. Floating slowly to the current, her heads and legs in the water, her skirt inflated like a balloon over her back. So, he witnesses someone trying to take their own life, so that'll change your way of thinking.
That's sort of a premonition that he has, just thinking about throwing himself into the deep, dark waters and just ending it all. I think I might have recalled seeing that part.
Well, he was disgusted by the scene, wasn't he?
Yeah, because
Yeah,
he was
and he thought
thinking about
about
killing himself, and then that happened, and he's just like, well, that was just a disgusting act. There's no way I'm going out like that.
Talk about the law of attraction in full
it's one of the,
spin.
it's the it's the others. It's going back to the internal struggle that he has. He wants to get away with the murder and everything, but he would end up living in this so-called fever dream where he ends up hallucinating this hellish version of reality. And at the other hand, it's better for him to just end it all by throwing himself in the river and drowning. So it's that eternal struggle of figuring out what's the best option to go out, surrender himself or kill himself.
And he almost like he refuses after witnessing the suicide attempt. Like he realizes in his heart of hearts that this is not what he's going to do because suicide is just such a terrible act. And of course, again, if we talk about religion, if you commit suicide, you're not getting into heaven. Granted, I don't think a murderer is either, but if you repent for your sins and you're forgiven and you pay the toll, and then you have a shot at an afterlife in the pearly gates. But the shame that comes with attempting suicide is just clearly not something he's interested in signing up for, because he knows that these are not the choices that he will be making. He's got the choice to conceal the crime or admit to the crime, but killing himself is not on the list for him.
It's just kind of a halfway point. If you kill yourself, you're not really confessing, but you're making it look like you are the one that did it. So you're kind of taking the easy way out by not confessing or concealing it. You're just going away.
Yeah. Well, it's good to know he's not a quitter. He's certainly demonstrated he's not a quitter in any capacity.
Yeah.
I suppose.
It's one big existential crisis.
Yeah, that's for sure.
It certainly puts in comparison all of the existential crises I've gone through and the actions I've taken. It's nice to know that I didn't kill anyone in my pit of existential crisis. You know, I don't feel so bad about smoking cigarettes now.
Yeah.
Like, that's as bad as it got. I smoked cigarettes, which is just kind of suicide on a long term.
Just partial suicide.
Exactly. So, you know, like the existential crisis of the millennials compared to the existential crisis of the 1800 era Russians is just completely different platitudes.
This might help the youth put some things into perspective. Maybe they wouldn't be so triggered as easily.
Wouldn't that be nice if people could read these sort of books and think, oh, maybe I don't need to freak out at the cashier. Maybe I don't need to be triggered by the person dancing at the club that I've decided to go to.
And books like these are not just an art, they're a way of understanding life.
Yeah, dude, they're a window into another person's soul.
Yeah.
I think it's essential. I mean, it's not essential, obviously, but I think it ought to be considered essential, because Socrates talks about the life unexamined not being worth lived. But what if there's more to that quote, that if you don't examine other lives, you don't know what life you're living?
Yes.
And this is such a safe space to be able to examine something like this, because it's terrible. I wouldn't want to go and interview Ted Bundy, which is blowing up on Netflix, all these interviews with killers. This is certainly something people do. They get introspection to other lives at a very firsthand level. But being able to read a book and allow an author to walk you through these sort of steps that someone would go through in this life is a lot easier. It's a lot more dissociated, and allows you to put in perspective your life without having to turn your life into putting your life into perspective by talking to people about their life.
Yeah, perspective is absolutely key. The more people's perspective you can understand, the better off you're going to be on your own path. I firmly believe that.
And it's much easier to just pick up a book for an hour or 2 hours a day, maybe even 20 minutes, and read, and then get back to the purpose that you're here for, instead of saying, oh, well, I don't know what it's like out there. I'll go talk to people. Books have made it very convenient to figure out how the world could work and how the world does work and how the mind might work without having to subject yourself to a mastery of understanding. You don't need to be a psych major to understand this story. You don't need to be anything. You simply need to be literate, and that's probably something I'm taking for granted. But to be able to read these accounts of all these great classics, it doesn't cost anything.
And
But the payout is tenfold.
For sure. And there's other ways you can gain perspective too, like just listening to podcasts, watching documentaries or interviews with certain people. Watch stuff by people you disagree with.
Yeah.
If something makes you mad, don't just turn it off. Figure out why they think that way. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Say, oh, you just have a different idea than me, not you're the devil, or literally.
To a degree.
Yeah.
I won't humor an anti-vaxxer. I'm pretty much done with that one.
Yeah, well, I think we've heard most of their arguments.
Yeah, and the flat earthers. Like, there's a few things that are like, okay, that's enough. But yeah, exactly. Like, if there was one thing I could advocate our listeners to really promote to their friends and family, it's listening to podcasts about people reading books.
Specifically this one.
Exactly.
Yes.
Like, comment, subscribe down below.
But honestly, like I love just any time I don't know what I'm doing and I need a little pick me up, like Jocko Willink's podcast. That one's a really good one. And Joe Rogan, obviously he can be all over the place. The Joe Rogan clips are pretty good as well. Like it's good to, like, if you get stuck in a vacuum, especially nowadays where there's so many people who are working from home and they have this super condensed community where they don't actually interact with many humans. Like, you need to supplement your existence with other people's opinions. Because if you get stuck, like we see in Crime and Punishment, in your own mind, you will come to some conclusions that do not hold water. But there's no water in your mind for it to spill out of. So you feel that you're right, but you haven't talked about it. You haven't thought about it. You've just ruminated, and you come to these ridiculous assumptions about the world and reality that limit you and turn you into this triggered wreck that goes out and murders a pawnbroker or yells at a taxi driver or never fixes their relationship with their family members and so on. And I think at the littlest, you should be listening to people talking about things that kind of interest you.
Yeah, absolutely. And the first book that we read in this book club before we started recording was a book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger. And he goes over how, like, hunter-gatherers lived in tribes, and, like, being surrounded by people 24/7 was the norm. Like, how often were people alone back in those days? 0% of the time. Like, there was always somebody there. And now you look in today's society, mostly every human has their own room where they shut themselves in for a majority of the day.
Oh, and that's just it. Like, the society that we live in now is built on the backs of a society that was incredibly religious and incredibly community driven. Like, if you look at the way education unfolded over the past 500 years, thank you, church. And now we're anti-religion and we're anti-community, and we're talking about these idealistic beliefs that we think are going to change the world, but we haven't taken the time to look at the history of our world and say, well, what works and how can we improve what's working? Instead of throwing out the wheel or throwing out the baby with the bathwater, we should be, I don't know, maybe just changing the water.
Yeah, that's the heart of the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debates.
Right.
We need to look at things a lot more clearly and carefully, which is not what which is something that not a whole lot of people do these days. I think they just take the original definition or their own definition based on what they've seen and turning it the other way around instead of just looking at it from a different perspective. Like I like how Jordan Peterson goes into detail about symbols in the biblical tales and even in Carl Jung and some of the Disney films. And instead of just looking at something that is just there on screen or like on a wall or whatever, instead we have to take a look at the symbols around. Like, what does this small section mean here?
I agree entirely. Yeah. Like, especially now with what's the term, reaction culture, where people are in the court of public opinion just completely chastising individuals and organizations for actions that are not good, that they don't agree with. They're undermining all of the good that organization or person has done. And instead of just methodically looking at systems and people and saying, okay, I don't like this part, but I do enjoy the whole, let's improve it. They're just trying to throw out everything, and what they put in replacement of that is nothing, is this vacuum. And you have Netflix and chill, and there's no system anymore. It's just chaos and anarchy, and maybe that's what the anarchists want, but a lot of us aren't anarchists, and we're just confused because we've grown up in a society that has done so many weird things, and we've been exposed to it so much because of the media and the way we're exposed to all sorts of events, that we're now throwing things out instead of exposing the rules that are creating them and saying, no, this isn't working anymore, but that doesn't mean it can't work for us again. I'm reading The Code of the Extraordinary Mind by Vishen Lakhiani, the creator of mindvalley.com, maybe? And he started that in 2003. And his book's great. Like, obviously it's great because he's a brilliant man. And he talks about rules, which is just this word he's come up with. He took the word rules, he put a B in front of it, and it stands for bullshit rules. And we just, through communication, we have learned how to start fires and spin wheels. And also, we've learned how to do really terrible things like not eat beef or go to church every Sunday and get our penises cut off. I don't know. We can go to any extreme with this, right? There's all sorts of random things that we do just because that's the way it's been done. And the minute we stop doing it, instead of questioning it and saying, well, does it have to be this way? Like, we're just rejecting entire schools of thought because there's one bullshit rule about it that doesn't click with us, and it shouldn't click with us because it doesn't make sense. And now we're set to go it alone and come up with a new system. And now we have so many random religions coming up nowadays. Like, obviously we want spirituality and we want a moral understanding of the world, and we want to work together, but we have no way to do it, and we're just trying to rebuild the wheel, and it's absurd.
Here's the kind of things that I think about when I listen to Jordan Peterson specifically. I think about like all the times that the Christian faith has divided through the ages. Like, it went from Orthodoxy to Roman Catholicism to all the Reformed churches of Calvinism and Lutheranism and everything like that. And Jordan Peterson seems to be actually uniting all these people that can't stand each other. Like, people that agree on certain things about religion but disagree on tiny little things. I think Jordan Peterson is kind of pointing out that those little differences don't really matter, and you can believe what you want, but there's something else to the religious community and the religious factor that isn't just, oh, you believe in the resurrection and you don't, so you can't go to church together. I think he's trying to tear that idea apart.
And it's like, I commend him for it because it's something we need so badly. Like, there's this whole divide between everything. At every turn, you can find a reason to be different from someone instead of looking at someone and saying, well, we're both humans and we probably want the planet to be around for another million years and we'd probably like to eat some good tasting food and be warm at night. We get split and we fight and we argue over just the most ridiculous. It's aesthetics. We're fighting over aesthetics.
Yeah, basically.
When our aesthetics, when you actually get outside of the microphone and the webcam, are awful and dismal, and our way that we live now is absurd. Like, millennials are having the most hardest time buying a house, and there are people on the other side of the world that can't even conceive of how to get a loaf of bread this week for their family of 8. And then you have systems of government that are completely different, and they're coming together in a United Nation board and talking about making the world a better place and just not even actually addressing the systemic problems of authoritarianism and communism and capitalism. All of them. There's something wrong with everything, and we stop criticizing the things we accept and we criticize the things that we don't need to criticize when we should just be improving across the board.
And to do that, we need to take another lesson from our teacher Jocko Willink and just detach from the situation to see it all in its full form. Don't just look at pieces of it and try to fix little bits of it, but you have to make sure you know what else that's going to affect.
Exactly. You can't just murder a pawnbroker and make the world a better place.
Yeah. There's a couple of better first steps than killing your local pawnbroker.
Yeah, I would advocate reading a book or volunteering as first steps.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't see that conversation coming out of this book, but I think that's what I love so much about this book club is that we can talk about a book and then talk about talking and share ideas that are interesting.
Yeah, man.
From our own perspective.
We got more on our minds than just crime and punishment these days. The crazy fast-paced world we live in.
Keep your stick on the ice, folks.
See y'all next time. Like, comment,
Later.
subscribe. Check out the podcast. Links are all in the description. Buy a copy of Crime and Punishment if you want.
Using our link on Amazon, of course.
Yes.
And let us know what you think about Crime and Punishment. We'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yes, for sure. May the force be with you.
Equal to mass times acceleration.